After my grandfather left me his entire $4 million estate, my parents, who abandoned me when I was just 4 months old, dragged me into federal court. They walked in wearing designer clothes, acting like they had already won, with my mother literally rolling her eyes at me from across the aisle. But then the judge looked at the single piece of evidence I handed over and did something that made my golden child sister scream out loud. The smell of baked macaroni and cheese and collard greens still lingered in the air of the grand South Chicago brownstone. It was the afternoon of my grandfather's repast. The house was usually filled with his booming laugh and the comforting scent of his favorite pipe tobacco, but today it was heavy with thick, suffocating grief. I was quietly stacking heavy porcelain plates at the long mahogany dining table, trying to find some peace in the repetitive motion. My heart was completely broken. I had just buried the only real father I ever knew. Suddenly, the heavy oak front doors swung open without a single knock. The quiet dignity of the mourning house was shattered by loud footsteps and the sharp click of designer heels on the hardwood floor. In walked Calvin and Denise, the people who biologically created me. I had not seen them in over 3 decades. They were dressed in high-end mourning attire that looked more suited for a fashion runway than a respectful funeral gathering. Trailing right behind them was my younger sister Chloe, clutching an oversized luxury handbag, and her husband Preston. Preston was a white tech bro from Silicon Valley who always wore expensive sneakers with tailored suit jackets and tried way too hard to use our cultural slang whenever he spoke. I froze with a stack of plates in my hands. None of them had bothered to show up for the actual church service this morning. They did not sit in the front pew, they did not shed a tear when the choir sang his favorite hymn. But here they were, parading into the home my grandfather built from the ground up, like they already owned the place. My name is Naomi. I am 35 years old, and a forensic accountant for the federal government specializing in corporate fraud and asset recovery. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand your ground against toxic family members who underestimated your intelligence and only saw you as something to throw away. Growing up in this house, my grandfather Pops taught me the value of hard work and the absolute importance of protecting generational wealth. He took me in as a baby because Calvin and Denise decided an infant would ruin their lavish social life and slow down their careers. They dropped me off in a car seat on his front porch and never looked back. A few years later, they had Chloe and raised her as the golden child in a wealthy gated suburb, while I stayed in South Chicago learning how to read complex financial statements before I could even ride a bike. Now they were standing in the very house they had avoided for 35 years, acting like royalty. Preston swaggered over to the head of the dining table, invading the space where Pops used to carve the turkey every Thanksgiving. He picked up a crystal water glass and grabbed a silver dessert spoon. He clinked the spoon against the glass, creating a sharp, piercing sound that forced the few remaining elderly church members in the living room to turn around. He looked right at me with a smirk that made my skin crawl. "Thank you to the help for setting up the catering," he announced, his voice echoing through the dining room, thick with extreme condescension. "The soul food was a nice touch, but the real family needs to discuss private matters now. You have until Monday morning to pack your bags and vacate my wife's property." With a dramatic flick of his wrist, Preston tossed a folded legal document onto the table. It landed right next to the remaining peach cobbler. I looked down. It was a formal eviction notice. I did not scream. I did not drop the plates. I just looked at the piece of paper and then up at the people who shared my DNA, but nothing else. Denise stepped over to the antique mirror in the hallway, adjusting her wide-brimmed black hat. She could not even look me in the eye when she spoke. "Do not make this difficult, Naomi," she sighed, waving her perfectly manicured hand in the air. "We all know Pops was not in his right mind these last few years. It is time for the rightful heirs to step in and clean up this mess. We are being generous, giving you the weekend to move your little things out." Chloe chimed in, popping her chewing gum and leaning heavily against Preston. "Seriously, Naomi," she whined. You have been living here for free your whole life, leeching off an old man. It is time to get a real job and a real apartment. Maybe Preston can write you a good reference letter for a janitorial company, since you are so good at cleaning up plates." Preston chuckled, wrapping his arm possessively around her waist. "Exactly. We are all about supporting the community. Just do not drag your feet on moving out. I already called a premium demolition crew to come on Tuesday morning. We are gutting this whole place, flipping it, and bringing some real value to this neighborhood." They wanted to gut the house. The house where my grandfather hosted community meetings to save local businesses, where he helped neighborhood kids pay for college, where he taught me everything I knew about surviving in a world designed to break us. They wanted to destroy his legacy for a quick flip. The sheer disrespect of discussing demolition while funeral guests were still paying their respects in the next room was staggering. But I kept my face completely blank. A good accountant never reveals her hand before the audit is complete. I slowly set the plates down on the table. I picked up the eviction notice. The paper was thin, but it carried the heavy weight of absolute betrayal. In their eyes, I was just the quiet, abandoned woman cleaning up after a funeral. They saw someone they thought they could easily bully, intimidate, and push out of the way. What they did not know was that I spend my days dismantling financial empires built by criminals 1,000 times smarter and more dangerous than a failed tech bro and 2 deadbeat parents. I folded the paper and slipped it into the pocket of my black dress. I gave them a polite professional smile that did not reach my eyes. "I understand," I said softly, my voice dangerously calm. "I will make sure everything is handled exactly the way it is supposed to be." Preston grinned at Calvin and Denise, looking incredibly smug, like he knew this would be easy. But as I turned my back on them, walked out of the dining room, and headed straight for my grandfather's locked home office, my smile dropped into a cold, hard stare. They wanted to start a war over real estate and money on the very day we buried the man who built it all. They had absolutely no idea they just declared war on the only person holding the legal keys to their complete destruction. I walked out of the dining room and stepped into the sunken living room where the rest of the extended family had gathered. My great-aunt Shirley and a few elders from the church were sitting on the velvet sofas, balancing paper plates of food on their laps. The low murmurs of their conversation died down the absolute second Calvin and Denise followed me into the room. My parents were not about to let me walk away quietly. They needed an audience for their next act. Denise positioned herself right in the center of the room, standing directly beneath the vintage crystal chandelier Pops had bought for my grandmother 30 years ago. She pulled a pristine white lace handkerchief from her expensive leather bag and began to dab at her perfectly dry eyes. Her voice trembled as she spoke, projecting just enough for every single person in the living room to hear her clearly. "This is just so incredibly hard," Denise sniffled, looking around at the sympathetic faces of our relatives. "Coming back into this house, seeing the space where my father took his last breaths, and having to deal with such bitter hostility from my own flesh and blood." I stopped in my tracks and turned around slowly. Hostility. That was a fascinating choice of words from a woman who just allowed her arrogant son-in-law to throw an eviction notice onto my dinner table. Denise pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me. "Do you have any idea how much your father and I sacrificed for you, Naomi? Do you honestly think it was easy for a young couple to leave their firstborn child behind? We did not abandon you. We made the ultimate sacrifice. We gave you to Pops so Calvin and I could go out into the world and build a real foundation. We suffered through sleepless nights, working our fingers to the bone to create generational wealth for this entire family. We gave you the greatest gift possible by letting you stay here in this beautiful home with a man who loved you." Chloe nodded vigorously, wiping a fake tear of her own from her heavily contoured cheek. "Mom and Dad built an empire, Naomi. They did it for all of us. And you just sat here in South Chicago hiding behind Pops, taking everything for granted." I looked over at Aunt Shirley, expecting her to see through this ridiculous performance. Instead, the older woman was nodding in agreement, her lips pursed tightly together. "Your mother is right, baby," Aunt Shirley murmured, setting her plate down on the coffee table. Calvin and Denise had to go out and make a way out of no way. You had Pops all to yourself for 35 years. You got to eat his cooking, hear his stories, and sleep under his warm roof. You monopolized that poor man while your parents were out there struggling for the greater good. The echo chamber had officially been activated. A chorus of quiet agreements and sympathetic sighs rippled through the living room. Other relatives shook their heads, looking at me with profound disappointment. They were completely buying into the narrative that I was the selfish villain who had hoarded my grandfather's affection. Denise stepped closer to me, dropping the sorrowful act and letting a sharp, venomous edge slip into her tone. You were a burden to him, Naomi, a lifelong heavy burden. And instead of being grateful that we provided you with such a comfortable setup, you got greedy. You manipulated a lonely, grieving old man in his final years. You took advantage of his failing memory to isolate him from his real family. Calvin, who had been standing silently with his hands tucked into his tailored pockets, finally spoke up. His voice was deep and filled with fabricated, righteous anger. We know you tried to turn him against us, Naomi. We know you poisoned his mind because you were jealous of the beautiful life we built for your sister. But your little game ends today. You are not going to steal the legacy we are rightfully owed. The sheer audacity of their performance was truly breathtaking. Generational wealth. That was the exact phrase Denise had the nerve to use in front of this room full of people. They lived in a rented mansion in Atlanta, driving leased luxury cars and projecting a fake image of Black excellence on the internet while actively drowning in massive debt. They had not built an empire. They had built a fragile house of cards, and Pops knew it. Pops? That was exactly why he kept his distance from them. He saw right through their expensive veneers and empty promises. I looked at the faces of my aunts and uncles. These were the very same people who had watched me mow my grandfather's lawn, shovel his snow, and drive him to every single cardiology appointment for the last decade, while Calvin and Denise could not even be bothered to send a cheap Christmas card. Yet here they were, nodding along, completely mesmerized by the designer mourning clothes and the polished lies. A sacrifice, I repeated, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. You left a 4-month-old infant in a car seat on a freezing porch in November so you could move to Atlanta and start a talent agency that went bankrupt 3 years later. You did not leave me here to build a legacy. You left me here because I was an inconvenience to your social climbing. The room went dead silent. Aunt Shirley gasped loudly, clutching her pearl necklace. Denise flared her nostrils, her fake tears instantly vanishing as her face flushed with pure, unadulterated rage. Her mask had slipped, showing the ugly truth underneath. Preston immediately stepped forward, puffing out his chest and trying to look physically intimidating. Watch how you speak to my mother-in-law, you ungrateful brat. You are just lashing out because the free ride is permanently over. Pops woke up at the very end and realized who his real family was, and he put it in writing. Preston reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored Tom Ford jacket. He pulled out a single sheet of paper encased in a clear plastic sleeve, holding it up high as if he had just discovered a winning lottery ticket. The chatter in the living room died completely. Every eye was locked on that piece of paper. This right here, Preston announced, his voice dripping with unbearable arrogance, is a holographic will. Handwritten and signed by your grandfather exactly 1 month ago. It entirely supersedes whatever outdated documents you thought you were relying on. He took a few steps forward, making sure Aunt Shirley and the church elders could see the blue ink on the page. In this document, Pops clearly states that he was of sound mind. He expressed deep regret for alienating his biological son over the years. And most importantly, he left the entirety of his $4 million estate, including his bank accounts, this house, and the commercial properties downtown, strictly to Calvin and Chloe. Chloe squealed and hugged her father's arm. Calvin stood taller, puffing out his chest, and looking around the room as if he had personally earned every single penny of that money through hard, honest work. Denise let out a loud, theatrical sigh of relief, pressing her hand against her chest. Thank the Lord, Denise whispered loudly. The legacy stays exactly where it belongs, with the real bloodline. I stared at the piece of paper in Preston's hand. A holographic will. A handwritten document supposedly scribbled a month before Pops passed away. Pops, who kept a heavy fireproof safe bolted to the floor in his home office. Pops, who had a high-priced estate lawyer on speed dial since the late 1990s. Pops, who insisted on having a notary present just to sign off on minor roof repairs for his rental properties. The idea that a man that incredibly meticulous about Black generational wealth would leave his entire life's work to a handwritten note was not just absurd, it was deeply insulting to his memory. But I kept my mouth completely shut. In my line of work as a federal investigator, you learn a very crucial lesson early on. You never ever interrupt a criminal while they are busy documenting their own fraud. You let them talk, you let them build their own trap. Since I am named as the executor in this updated will, Preston continued tucking the paper back into his expensive jacket. I am taking immediate administrative control of the estate. And frankly, Naomi, after your little outburst just now, I do not feel comfortable leaving you in this house for the weekend. You have proven yourself to be hostile. He pulled out his smartphone, tapping the screen with heavy, aggressive strikes. He put the phone on speaker, allowing a robotic voice from the local utility company to fill the silent living room. Preston navigated the automated menu with practiced ease. "What are you doing?" Aunt Shirley asked softly, her brow furrowed in confusion and growing concern. "Protecting our assets," Preston replied sharply. He pressed 0 to speak to a human representative. "Yes, hello. My name is Preston, and I am the executor for the estate at this address. I need to request an immediate shutoff of all services. Yes, the electricity, the water, and the internet. Expedite it for tonight, please. The property is vacant." He ended the call and shoved the phone into his pocket. He looked at me, his pale blue eyes gleaming with sheer unadulterated malice. "The Wi-Fi is already disconnected. The power and water will be cut by 8 o'clock tonight. I suggest you start packing your bags right now, unless you want to figure out how to navigate those steep stairs in the pitch black." A collective gasp rippled through the remaining funeral guests. Even for Calvin and Denise, this was a brutally cold move. Turning off the lights and water on a grieving woman on the exact day of her grandfather's funeral. But none of the relatives spoke up. They just averted their eyes, looking down at their shoes or staring at the walls. They were too intimidated by the flashy suits, the aggressive legal jargon, and the loud confidence of these intruders to intervene. They chose the path of least resistance. Chloe crossed her arms, her designer bracelets clinking together harshly. "You heard him, Naomi. Chop, chop. We will be waiting right here in the foyer to make sure you do not try to steal any of the family silver on your way out." I looked at the four of them standing shoulder to shoulder, a united front of pure greed. They really thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought stripping me of electricity and internet would render me completely helpless and isolated. They expected me to break down crying, to beg them for a few more days, or to start screaming and throwing punches like a stereotypical reality television star. They wanted me to lose my temper so they could call the police and have me dragged out in handcuffs. Instead, I did the one thing that visibly unsettled them. I smiled. It was not a wide smile. It was barely a twitch at the corner of my mouth, but it was enough to make Preston shift his weight uncomfortably and drop his smug grin for a fraction of a second. "Understood," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly even. "I will go pack my things." I turned my back on them and walked slowly up the grand oak staircase. I could feel their eyes burning into my back, but I did not rush my steps. I walked with my head held high. When I reached my bedroom, I closed the door and locked it with a heavy click. I pulled my large leather suitcase from the closet and laid it flat on the mattress. The room was already growing dim as the late afternoon sun dipped behind the Chicago skyline. I did not bother packing the heavy furniture or the bulky winter coats. I packed my clothes, my personal documents, and the framed photograph of Pops holding me when I was a toddler. I packed with precision and speed. Then I reached under my bed and pulled out the heavy matte black briefcase that I carried to the federal building every single day. Inside was my government-issued encrypted laptop. It was equipped with a military-grade cellular hotspot that bypassed civilian internet networks entirely. I flipped it open. The screen glowed to life, instantly casting a sharp blue light across my face in the darkening room. Preston thought cutting the house's Wi-Fi would disconnect me from the world. He had no idea that I had clearance to access federal financial databases that could track a single hidden dollar bill across the globe. He thought a fake piece of paper scribbled with blue ink would secure him $4 million. I watched the encryption software load, tracing the secure connection back to the servers in Washington. They wanted to play a dirty game of paper and numbers. They had absolutely no idea they had just handed a loaded weapon to a master forensic accountant. Let them have the dark house tonight. Because by the time I was finished auditing their entire pathetic existence, they were going to lose absolutely everything. The morning sun broke through the heavy curtains of my bedroom, but it brought absolutely no warmth. True to his word, Preston had managed to get the utilities shut off late last night. The radiators were ice cold and the silence in the house was deafening, without the low hum of the refrigerator or the ticking of the hallway clock. I had slept for perhaps 3 hours, fully dressed in a fresh pair of black slacks and a crisp white blouse. My leather suitcase was packed and waiting by the door. My encrypted government laptop was secured inside my briefcase, locked tight with a biometric seal. At exactly 7 in the morning, the heavy pounding began. It was not the polite knock of a family member. It was the hard, authoritative rapping of law enforcement. I grabbed my bags and made my way down the dark, unheated staircase. Through the frosted glass panes of the front door, I could see the flashing blue lights of a Chicago Police Department cruiser parked right in my grandfather's driveway. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy oak door open. 2 uniformed officers stood on the porch, looking stern and impatient. Standing safely behind them on the front walkway was the entire welcoming committee. Preston was wearing a Patagonia fleece vest over a designer button-down, holding a steaming cup of artisan coffee. Chloe was clinging to his arm, wearing oversized sunglasses to hide the fact that she had clearly barely woken up. Denise and Calvin stood a few paces back, trying to look like concerned property owners rather than vultures circling a fresh kill. "Good morning, officers," I said, my voice steady and professional. "How can I help you?" The older officer, a heavy-set man with a thick mustache, looked down at a clipboard in his hands. "Are you Naomi? We received a call from the legal executor of this estate regarding an unauthorized squatter refusing to vacate the premises." A squatter. I had lived in this house for 35 years. I had paid the property taxes out of my own bank account for the last 3 years, when Pop started forgetting to mail the checks. But I did not let a single ounce of anger show on my face. Preston stepped forward safely, positioning himself just behind the shoulder of the younger officer. He spoke with the loud, practiced confidence of a mediocre white man who had spent his entire life failing upward. "Officers, I showed you the documentation," Preston said, using his best corporate boardroom voice. "I have the holographic will right here. As the named executor, I have a fiduciary duty to secure this property immediately. She was served with a formal eviction notice yesterday afternoon, and she is currently trespassing. We need her removed so we can begin the property valuation process." He was throwing around legal terms like confetti, hoping the sheer volume of his vocabulary would overwhelm the patrol officers. Fiduciary duty, holographic will, property valuation. He was weaponizing his privilege and his perceived status to turn a civil family dispute into a criminal matter. I looked past the officers and locked eyes with my mother. Denise quickly looked away, pretending to be highly interested in the bare branches of the oak tree in the front yard. Calvin just crossed his arms, attempting to look stoic, but mostly just looking incredibly guilty. They were actually going to stand there and let this arrogant outsider use the police to throw their own flesh and blood onto the freezing pavement. "Ma'am," the older officer said, his tone softening just a fraction, perhaps noticing the sheer absurdity of calling a woman standing calmly with her luggage a hostile squatter. "It is a civil matter, but the gentleman does have paperwork claiming executive control of the house. To avoid any breach of peace, we are going to have to ask you to step off the property. If you want to contest the will, you need to take that up with a probate judge on Monday." I knew the law better than anyone standing on that porch. I knew that a handwritten will meant absolutely nothing until it was authenticated in a court of law. I knew Preston had zero legal authority to act as an executor until a judge officially appointed him. I could have stood my ground. I could have cited the exact Illinois state statutes regarding tenant rights and probate procedures. I could have demanded they call a supervisor. But I also knew the reality of being a black woman in America, arguing with law enforcement on a front porch. I knew that raising my voice even slightly would give Preston exactly what he wanted. I saw his free hand slipping into his pocket, ready to pull out his phone and hit record. He wanted me to yell. He wanted me to resist. He wanted a viral video of an angry, unhinged woman being aggressively handcuffed and dragged off the property so he could use it as character evidence in court to prove I was mentally unstable. Furthermore, as a federal employee with high-level security clearance, an arrest record for trespassing or resisting an officer would instantly trigger an internal investigation and potentially cost me my job. He thought he had engineered the perfect trap. I looked at the officer and gave a polite, understanding nod. There will be no breach of peace, officer. I have already packed my belongings. I am leaving voluntarily. Preston looked visibly disappointed. His shoulders slumped slightly as the anticipated drama evaporated into the cold morning air. I pulled my suitcase out onto the porch and pulled the heavy front door shut behind me until the deadbolt clicked. I reached into my purse and pulled out my set of house keys. Preston immediately stepped forward, holding out his hand with a smug, expectant grin. I completely ignored him. Instead, I handed the keys directly to the older police officer. "Please ensure these are logged as part of your incident report," I said clearly. "I am surrendering access to the property under duress based on an unverified document to comply with your instructions. Have a safe shift, officers." I gripped the handle of my suitcase and walked down the porch steps. I walked right past Preston, who was left standing awkwardly with his hand still outstretched. I walked past Chloe, who scowled at my designer coat. I walked past Calvin and Denise, who parted like the Red Sea to let me through. "Make sure you do not leave any trash on the lawn on your way out." Preston called out to my back, trying to salvage his moment of triumph. I did not stop. I did not turn around. I simply walked to the curb, where my pre-scheduled black car service was already waiting. The driver loaded my luggage into the trunk, and I slid into the warm, quiet leather interior of the back seat. As the car pulled away from the curb, I looked out the tinted window. I watched Preston unlock the front door of my grandfather's house, ushering my parents and sister inside like a conquering king claiming his castle. They thought they had won. They thought kicking me out into the cold was the end of the game. I opened my briefcase and rested my hand on the cold metal casing of my federal laptop. Let them have the empty house for the weekend. The real war was not going to be fought with loud voices on a front porch. It was going to be fought with silent keystrokes, IP addresses, and bank statements. And I was about to burn their entire kingdom straight to the ground. The black car dropped me off at a discreet luxury hotel downtown. I checked into a corner suite paid for with my own money and immediately set up my temporary command center on the heavy glass desk. I was just about to connect my federal laptop to the secure encrypted network when my personal cell phone started vibrating violently against the glass. It was not just one call. It was a relentless flood of text messages, missed calls, and social media notifications. I unlocked my screen and tapped on a link sent by one of my cousins. It opened the TikTok app. Staring back at me from the screen were my mother Denise and my sister Chloe. They were sitting on the velvet sofa in my grandfather's living room, the exact spot where they had just evicted me hours ago. But their designer funeral clothes were gone. Denise was wearing a plain, oversized sweater with zero makeup, looking exhausted and heartbroken. Chloe was leaning her head on our mother's shoulder, wiping her eyes with a crumpled tissue. The caption across the screen read, "Saving our grandfather from his abuser." The video already had over 2 million views. Denise looked directly into the camera, her voice shaking with fake trauma. She told the internet a horrifying story. She claimed that for the past 5 years I had been systematically isolating Pops from his blood relatives. She actually used the medical term Munchausen by proxy, claiming I kept him deliberately sick and over-medicated so he would depend entirely on me. She said I changed the locks, blocked their phone numbers, and brainwashed an elderly man with dementia into hating his own children. Then Chloe looked at the camera with wide, innocent eyes. She said she had tried to visit Pops for Christmas, but I had threatened her and chased her off the porch. She cried about how much she missed her grandfather and how grateful they were to finally rescue his estate from my toxic grip so he could rest in peace. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. The comments section was an absolute war zone. Thousands of strangers were calling for my arrest. But the worst part was not the strangers. It was my own community. The video had been shared to the official Facebook page of our family church in South Chicago. People who had watched me grow up, people I had served alongside at Thanksgiving food drives, were now leaving vicious comments. Aunt Shirley wrote a long paragraph about how she always knew there was a dark spirit in me. Cousins who had asked me for free financial advice just last month were calling me a sociopath and a gold digger. They were completely excommunicating me from the only community I had ever known, based on a 3-minute performance by 2 women who had not set foot in a church in 20 years. I did not cry. Crying was a waste of hydration and time. But then the screen flashed with a name that made my posture straighten immediately. It was Director Hughes, my commanding officer at the federal agency. Getting a phone call from the director on a Saturday morning was never a good sign. I answered on the first ring. "Good morning, Director," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "Naomi," he replied, his voice gruff and incredibly serious. "I am going to keep this brief. Our internal public relations department just flagged a viral video on social media. Your face and full name are being broadcast to millions of people alongside accusations of elder abuse and psychological manipulation. You know the strict rules for our department. As a federal forensic investigator, your credibility in court must be absolutely bulletproof. Defense attorneys will use anything to destroy your character on the stand." "I understand, Director," I said calmly, watching the Chicago skyline through the hotel window. "I assure you these accusations are entirely fabricated. The people in that video are my estranged biological parents and sister. They are currently attempting to execute a hostile takeover of my late grandfather's estate using a forged holographic will. This video is a preemptive smear campaign to discredit me before I can challenge them in probate court." Director Hughes was silent for a long moment. He had read my file when I was hired. He knew my background, and he knew I was the most relentless auditor in his entire division. "Naomi, do you need to take administrative leave to handle this family dispute?" he finally asked. "No, sir," I replied immediately. Taking leave would imply I am retreating and validate their lies. But I am formally requesting clearance to run an expedited background check and full financial audit on an individual named Preston and a corporate entity based in Silicon Valley. I also need to pull the federal tax records for Calvin and Denise residing in Atlanta, Georgia. I suspect severe tax evasion and potential securities fraud. Do you have probable cause?" Hughes asked, his tone shifting from concerned boss to federal investigator. "I am a named stakeholder in an estate they are actively trying to defraud," I answered. "That makes me a direct victim of their financial crimes. I am initiating a defensive investigation to protect my assets and my federal clearance." "Keep it clean," Naomi Hughes warned. "Do not cross any legal lines. You have your clearance." He hung up the phone. I placed my cell phone face down on the desk, completely ignoring the thousands of people screaming at me on the internet. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner of my federal laptop. The thick protective screen glowed green, granting me access to the deepest financial databases in the country. My family wanted to play the victim on social media to win the court of public opinion. They had absolutely no idea I was about to play the executioner in federal court. I opened a blank digital dossier and typed Preston's name into the global registry. It was time to follow the money. The hotel room was dead silent except for the rapid rhythmic clicking of my keyboard. Most people who had just been evicted by their own family and publicly humiliated in front of millions of people on the internet would be curled up in bed crying. I did not have the luxury of tears. I had a puzzle to solve. I stared at the dual monitors I had requested from the hotel concierge, connecting them to my secure federal terminal. The screen reflected in my eyes a cascading waterfall of green data on a stark black background. I started with Preston. He loved bragging about his Silicon Valley startup, claiming he was revolutionizing artificial intelligence for global logistics. He loved using corporate buzzwords to make himself sound untouchable. I typed his full legal name and his company name into the federal employer database. Within 3 seconds, I had his employer identification number. I cross-referenced that 9-digit code with the Securities and Exchange Commission database to pull his corporate filings. What I found made me scoff out loud in the empty room. Preston was not a tech genius. He was a professional con artist running a high-tech Ponzi scheme. His company had burned through 3 rounds of venture capital funding with zero actual product to show for it. I traced the IP addresses of his supposed offshore development teams and found they led directly to empty server farms in Eastern Europe. He was deliberately shifting investor money into a complex maze of shell companies registered in Delaware. He was using those hidden funds to pay for his designer clothes, his expensive sports cars, and his lavish lifestyle with Chloe. But the well had officially run dry. According to the internal banking flags triggered on his accounts, he had missed payroll for his remaining staff twice last month. His primary corporate accounts were currently overdrawn by nearly $200,000. He was weeks away from total financial collapse and severe federal wire fraud charges. Next, I turned my attention to Calvin and Denise. They had spent the last 20 years projecting an aggressive image of Black excellence and extreme wealth down in Atlanta. They constantly posted photos from yacht parties, luxury vacations, and exclusive country clubs. I pulled up the state property records for Fulton County, Georgia. Their massive gated mansion was actually a rental, and they were 3 months behind on payments. But that was just the appetizer. I tapped into the Internal Revenue Service clearance portal using my federal authorization to pull their complete tax history. The screen flashed bright red with warning indicators. Calvin and Denise had not paid federal income taxes in 6 years. They had been aggressively hiding their income through a series of fraudulent business expenses tied to their long-failed talent agency. The IRS had already issued a massive tax lien against them, totaling over $2.5 million. Their luxury leased vehicles were scheduled for repossession within the next 14 days. I leaned back in the ergonomic hotel chair, lacing my fingers together and taking a deep breath. The pieces of the puzzle snapped together perfectly, forming a very ugly and desperate picture. They did not come back to Chicago because they suddenly remembered they had a father. They did not show up to the funeral out of respect or grief. They came back because they were drowning. Pop's dying was their winning lottery ticket. They desperately needed that $4 million estate to pay off their massive debts and stay out of federal prison. The audacity of their TikTok video suddenly made perfect sense. They were projecting. They called me a gold digger who manipulated an old man because that was exactly what they were trying to do. They thought targeting a quiet, grieving woman living alone in a South Chicago house was the easiest score of their lives. They assumed I was just a low-level pencil pusher who would roll over, surrender the keys, and disappear into the shadows. They were so arrogant they did not even bother to cover their digital tracks. I systematically saved the SEC reports, the overdrawn bank statements, and the IRS tax liens onto a heavily encrypted government flash drive. I now had the smoking gun. I had the absolute proof of their financial desperation and their motive to forge a will. But I knew better than to reveal my hand too early. Dropping these documents on a table would only make them scatter like roaches when the lights turn on. I needed them to commit to their lie on the public record. I needed them to walk straight into a perjury trap where they could not escape the legal consequences. I closed the laptop and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the glittering Chicago skyline. Tomorrow was Monday. The courts and the banks would officially be open. Knowing how desperate they were for immediate cash to hold off their creditors, I knew exactly where Preston and Calvin would go first thing in the morning. They would not wait for the probate court to validate their fake holographic will. They would try to raid my grandfather's primary bank accounts using intimidation and pressure. They thought they had outsmarted me by throwing me out into the cold. But I was the one holding the matches, and they were standing in a house soaked in gasoline. I set my alarm for 6 in the morning and finally laid down to get some sleep. Tomorrow, I was going to the bank, and I was going to watch them dig their own graves right in the middle of the VIP lobby. Monday morning arrived with a bitter chill sweeping off Lake Michigan, but my mind was completely clear and sharply focused. I wore a tailored navy blue suit, my hair pulled back into a flawless bun, and carried my leather briefcase. I walked through the heavy brass doors of the Legacy Bank in downtown Chicago, where my grandfather had maintained his primary accounts for over 4 decades. The interior was a fortress of old money, with towering marble pillars, hushed acoustics, and an atmosphere that demanded respect and discretion. Usually the only sounds in the grand lobby were the soft clicking of keyboards and the low murmur of polite financial consultations. But today, that dignified silence was being violently disrupted. Even before I reached the frosted glass doors of the private wealth management wing, I could hear the loud, aggressive voice of my biological father echoing across the Italian marble floors. "I am the eldest son." Calvin was shouting, his voice completely stripped of the fake, refined tone he used on social media. "I provided the documentation to your front desk an hour ago. We are the legal heirs to the estate. You are holding our funds hostage, and I will have your job for this." I walked calmly toward the source of the commotion. In the center of the VIP lobby, Calvin was leaning over the mahogany desk of a junior bank officer, pointing his finger aggressively in the young man's face. Calvin was wearing a loud, heavily branded designer tracksuit, trying to look like a wealthy music executive, but mostly just looking desperate. Standing right beside him was Preston, wearing a sharp gray suit and holding his leather portfolio with an air of profound, unearned authority. I stepped through the glass doors and stood silently near the entrance, observing them. They were demanding immediate access to my grandfather's liquid assets. More specifically, I heard Preston demand a direct wire transfer of $500,000. Preston turned his head and spotted me standing there. For a fraction of a second, his eyes darted nervously, but he quickly masked his panic with a wide, arrogant smirk. He nudged Calvin and pointed his chin in my direction. "Well, look who it is," Preston said loudly, ensuring the other wealthy clients in the lobby could hear him. "Did the police finally kick you to the curb, Naomi? Are you here to withdraw the last few dollars from your little checking account before you go stay in a cheap motel?" I did not take the bait. I walked forward slowly, my heels clicking against the marble floor. I looked at the junior bank officer, who seemed incredibly relieved by the distraction. Then I looked back at Preston. "I am here to handle the legitimate administrative duties of my grandfather's estate," I replied, my voice perfectly level and quiet, which only highlighted how ridiculously loud they were being. "I see you two are struggling to do the same." Preston scoffed, stepping directly into my personal space. He looked down his nose at me, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "We are not struggling with anything. We are simply dealing with incompetent banking staff who do not understand the urgency of high-level financial transitions. But I suppose I should not expect you to understand either." He leaned in slightly, adopting the patronizing tone of a professor speaking to a slow child. "You see, Naomi, in the venture capital world, we operate on an entirely different frequency. When a major asset portfolio like this changes hands, we require immediate liquidity. We are requesting a modest $500,000 capital release for aggressive portfolio restructuring and bridge funding for my tech firm. It is about maintaining momentum." He crossed his arms, looking incredibly pleased with his own vocabulary. "I know someone in your position probably does not grasp the velocity of startup cash flow." He continued, his voice dripping with condescension. Doing basic tax returns and managing small payrolls is cute, but real wealth requires immediate capital deployment. You cannot just sit on cash the way your grandfather did. We are modernizing the family assets. I would try to explain burn rates and series funding to you, but honestly, it would just go right over your head. Stick to your little calculator, Naomi. Leave the corporate finance to the professionals. Every single word out of his mouth was a calculated microaggression. He was looking right at a federal forensic accountant, a woman who regularly testified in federal court against billionaire fraudsters, and speaking to me as if I were a clueless child playing with a piggy bank. He was weaponizing his whiteness and his fake tech bro persona to make me feel small and uneducated. But I did not feel small. I felt a deep, overwhelming sense of satisfaction. I looked at the specific numbers running through my head. From my federal database search last night, I knew Preston was overdrawn by exactly $200,000 and was facing imminent federal wire fraud charges if he did not pay his phantom employees by Wednesday. I also knew Calvin and Denise needed a minimum payment of $300,000 by the end of the week to stop the IRS from publicly seizing their leased mansion in Atlanta. 200,000 plus 300,000 equaled exactly $500,000. They were not modernizing the family assets. They were trying to rob a dead man's bank account to pay off their own criminal debts. And they were doing it loudly, aggressively, and in front of multiple high-definition security cameras. You are absolutely right, Preston. I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. I am sure I could never fully comprehend the complex strategies of your specific business model. It sounds incredibly demanding, especially when you need $500,000 in cash on a Monday morning just to keep the lights on. Calvin shot me a furious glare, stepping away from the desk. You shut your mouth, Naomi. You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. You have been living in the dark ages while we have been out building a legacy. Pops wanted us to have this money to grow the empire. Before I could respond, the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the VIP lobby swung open. The noise and the posturing immediately came to a grinding halt. Stepping out of the executive suite was a tall, distinguished older black man in a pristine charcoal suit. It was Mr. Sterling, the senior vice president of the bank, and Pop's closest financial confidant for the last 30 years. He held a thick file folder in his hands, and his expression was as cold and unforgiving as a winter storm. The game was about to shift, and I was more than ready to watch them hit the concrete. Mr. Sterling approached the mahogany desk with the slow, measured steps of a man who controlled billions of dollars and had absolutely zero tolerance for foolishness. He adjusted his gold wire-rimmed glasses and looked directly at Calvin, completely ignoring Preston for the moment. Calvin immediately tried to switch his demeanor. He forced a wide, overly familiar smile and reached his hand out across the desk. "Sterling, my brother, it has been way too long," Calvin boomed, trying to sound like a fellow titan of industry. "I appreciate you coming out here. As you know, my father passed away this weekend. We are just trying to get his affairs in order, and your junior associate here is giving us a hard time over a simple standard withdrawal." Mr. Sterling did not take Calvin's hand. He simply looked at it until Calvin awkwardly pulled it back and stuffed it into his tracksuit pocket. "My deepest condolences on the passing of Jeremiah," Mr. Sterling said, his voice a rich, deep baritone that commanded instant respect. "Your father was a pillar of the South Chicago community and a personal friend of mine for over 30 years, which is exactly why I am personally intervening in this highly irregular situation." Preston, sensing that Calvin was losing control of the room, stepped forward and slid the clear plastic sleeve containing the holographic will across the desk. "Mr. Sterling, there is nothing irregular about this," Preston said, using his sharpest corporate tone. "Pops left a handwritten will naming my wife and my father-in-law as the sole beneficiaries. It also names me as the executor of the estate. We need to execute a wire transfer of $500,000 to my corporate holding account immediately to cover funeral expenses and property management fees." Mr. Sterling did not even pick up the piece of paper. He looked down at it through his glasses and then looked back up at Preston. "Funeral expenses. Mr. Sterling repeated flatly. The funeral was fully paid for 5 years ago through a prepaid policy I helped Jeremiah set up. As for property management, this bank handles all of his commercial real estate trusts. Preston swallowed hard, his pale face flushing slightly. Well, there are other immediate administrative costs, he stammered, trying to recover. The point is, I am the executor, and I am authorizing the release of funds. Mr. Sterling sighed heavily, a sound of profound disappointment. Sir, you are not the executor of anything until a probate judge bangs a gavel and hands you a letter of testamentary. What you have there is a piece of paper with blue ink on it. It has not been authenticated. It has not been filed with the county clerk. And it certainly does not grant you the authority to walk into a federal banking institution and demand $500,000 in cash. Calvin's fake smile completely vanished. His eyes widened with panic. Wait a minute. Calvin interrupted, his voice rising in pitch. That is my father's handwriting. I am his biological son. I am the direct heir. You cannot hold my money hostage because of some bureaucratic red tape. It is not red tape, Calvin, Mr. Sterling replied sharply. It is federal banking law. Until a probate court verifies that document and issues official orders, every single account belonging to Jeremiah is frozen. Nobody makes a deposit, and nobody makes a withdrawal. Not a single dime is leaving this bank. That was the exact moment Calvin completely lost his mind. The carefully crafted illusion of the wealthy Atlanta businessman shattered into a million pieces, revealing the desperate drowning debtor underneath. Calvin slammed both of his fists down onto the mahogany desk so hard that the junior bank officer's computer monitor shook. "Do not play games with me, Sterling," Calvin roared, spit flying from his lips. "That is my money. I know exactly how much he had tucked away in those accounts. I need those funds cleared today. You are going to authorize that wire transfer right now, or I am going to sue this bank for everything it is worth. I will call the local news. I will tell everyone how you steal from grieving Black families." The entire VIP lobby fell dead silent. Wealthy clients stopped their conversations and stared. Bank tellers peeked over their stations. Calvin was throwing a massive, uncontrollable tantrum in the middle of one of the most exclusive financial institutions in the city. Preston, realizing how incredibly bad this looked, tried to grab Calvin's arm. "Calvin, calm down," Preston hissed, pulling at the tracksuit sleeve. "Let me handle the legal threats." "Get your hands off me," Calvin shouted, shoving Preston backward. "You told me this was going to be easy. You told me that piece of paper was a golden ticket. I need that $300,000 by Friday or I am ruined." He had said it out loud. In his blind rage, Calvin had literally just confessed his exact financial deficit in front of a dozen witnesses, including a senior bank vice president and a federal forensic accountant. He needed $300,000 by Friday, the exact amount of the IRS tax lien I had found on my computer the night before. I stood a few feet away, my hands calmly folded in front of me, watching them self-destruct. It was a beautiful disaster. Preston, who had just minutes ago mocked me for not understanding startup cash flow, was now sweating profusely, desperately trying to shush his father-in-law who was screaming about being ruined. Mr. Sterling did not flinch. He slowly reached under the desk and pressed a concealed button. Within 10 seconds, 3 large armed security guards in tailored suits materialized from the hallway, forming a wall behind Mr. Sterling. "Calvin," Mr. Sterling said, his voice dangerously low. "You are going to take your unverified piece of paper, you are going to turn around, and you are going to walk out of my lobby. If you ever raise your voice at my staff or slam your hands on my furniture again, I will have you arrested for disturbing the peace. If you want to discuss Jeremiah's accounts, you can have your attorney contact our legal department after a judge validates your claim." Calvin stood there, chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically between the 3 armed guards and Mr. Sterling's cold stare. He realized he had completely lost. The easy payday he had planned on was locked behind a vault he could not breach. He snatched the plastic sleeve off the desk and pointed a shaking finger at Mr. Sterling. "You are going to regret this," he spat, Preston grabbed his leather portfolio and quickly power-walked toward the exit, not even waiting for Calvin. Calvin turned to follow him, but before he reached the glass doors, he stopped and glared at me. I just offered him a polite, serene smile. I watched them shove their way out through the heavy brass doors and storm down the sidewalk. The silence slowly returned to the VIP lobby. I stepped forward, approaching the desk. Mr. Sterling looked at me, and the harshness in his eyes melted away entirely. He gave me a slow, knowing nod of respect. They had dug their own graves, and we both knew it. Now it was my turn to get to work. I walked out of the Legacy Bank, letting the heavy brass doors swing shut behind me. The crisp wind coming off Lake Michigan felt incredibly refreshing against my face. I hailed a black car and headed straight back to my hotel suite. The morning had been a spectacular display of their absolute incompetence, but a forensic accountant knows that witnessing a public meltdown is not the same as securing a legal conviction. I needed the hard, indisputable paper trail. I needed to lock them into a corner they could never talk their way out of. I walked into my room, tossed my suit jacket onto the bed, and sat down at the glass desk. I woke up my federal laptop. While I was at the bank watching Calvin throw his massive tantrum, my deep dive algorithms had been quietly running in the background, scraping through layers of encrypted financial data. The initial manual search last night had shown me the surface level of their debts. Now the automated algorithms had delivered the microscopic details. It was time to peel back the first real layer of the onion and see exactly how rotten the core truly was. I opened the completed digital dossier on Preston. He loved projecting the image of a visionary tech founder disrupting the global market. The algorithm revealed a completely different reality. His Silicon Valley artificial intelligence company was nothing more than a registered agent address located in a dilapidated strip mall in San Jose. There were no massive server farms. There were no brilliant software developers coding late into the night. There was only a hollow shell corporation specifically designed to funnel money from gullible angel investors directly into his personal checking accounts. But the algorithm had flagged something much more immediate and dangerous than a simple overdrawn bank balance. It had intercepted a series of highly aggressive legal demands from a boutique private equity firm in New York. The investors had officially realized Preston sold them phantom software. They were not just suing him in civil court. They had hired private asset recovery agents to track him down and seize his physical assets. That explained exactly why he was hiding out in Chicago playing the role of the grieving son-in-law. He was running from powerful people who did not care about his fake corporate vocabulary or his holographic wills. They just wanted their money back, and they were closing in fast. Next, I opened the expanded file on my parents. I already knew about their massive $2.5 million debt to the Internal Revenue Service, but the new data painted a picture of immediate catastrophic ruin. The luxury mansion they loved to flaunt on their daily social media posts was currently the subject of an active eviction and foreclosure lawsuit filed in Fulton County Court. Their landlord had completely lost patience after 6 months of bounced checks. I opened a PDF copy of the court summons the algorithm had pulled from the public county records. They were legally ordered by a judge to vacate the premises by this coming Friday. The exact day Calvin had screamed about needing $300,000 to avoid being ruined. The illusion of their black excellence was entirely shattered. They were not just broke. They were about to be physically thrown out onto the street by sheriff deputies with nothing but the designer clothes on their backs. Denise was literally posting crying videos on TikTok about my grandfather's estate, while surrounded by moving boxes she could not afford to put into storage. I leaned closer to the monitor, cross-referencing the dates of these various legal disasters. The sheer desperation was palpable. The date the private equity firm filed their lawsuit against Preston was October 12th. The date the Atlanta landlord filed the eviction notice against Calvin and Denise was October 14th. And the date written in blue ink on that fake holographic will Preston waved around in the bank lobby this morning. October 15th. I let out a low, humorless laugh that echoed in the quiet hotel room. They had literally sat down together in a state of sheer panic, entirely cornered by their own financial crimes, and hatched a desperate plan to rob my grandfather. They had forged that document the exact same week their respective worlds started crashing down around them. They thought Pops was an easy target because he was old, and they thought I would be a minor speed bump on their way to the bank vault because I was just the quiet girl they abandoned. I began exporting the court summons, the angry investor emails, the shell company registrations, and the bank transaction logs. I organized every single document into a secure encrypted folder, labeling it with clinical precision. This was no longer just a bitter family dispute over a house. This was a coordinated conspiracy to commit wire fraud, bank fraud, and perjury. And I had the absolute proof of their motive mapped out down to the exact day. Just as I finished encrypting the final file, my phone buzzed on the desk. It was an email from a high-priced probate attorney Preston had clearly hired using whatever tiny bit of credit he had left to his name. The subject line read, "Notice of deposition." I opened the email. They were formally summoning me to an official legal proceeding on Wednesday to give sworn testimony regarding my grandfather's state of mind and my alleged interference with the estate. They actually wanted to put me in a conference room with a court reporter and try to intimidate me into surrendering the estate. They wanted to force me to answer their questions under oath. I smiled, staring at the mountain of federal evidence glowing brightly on my dual monitors. I clicked reply, typed two simple words, confirming my attendance, and hit send. They wanted to go on the legal record. I was more than happy to give them the opportunity to swear on a Bible and lie directly to a judge. The hunt was officially on. Wednesday morning arrived with a heavy blanket of gray clouds hanging over the city. I walked into the sleek high-rise office building in downtown Chicago, wearing a sharp gray suit and carrying nothing but my briefcase. The law firm Preston had hired occupied the entire 40th floor. It was a firm known for aggressive litigation and exorbitant billing rates, which told me Preston was either maxing out his last remaining credit card or he had promised the lawyer a massive percentage of my grandfather's estate on contingency. I was escorted into a massive glass-walled conference room. Sitting at the long mahogany table was a court reporter quietly setting up her stenograph machine. Across from her sat the united front of my estranged family. Calvin was wearing a conservative suit today, trying to look respectable. Denise had a silk scarf draped over her shoulders, her face locked into an expression of manufactured sorrow. Preston sat next to them looking incredibly arrogant, tapping a gold pen against a thick legal pad. At the head of the table sat their legal counsel, Attorney Harrison. He was a sharp-featured man with slicked-back hair and the predatory smile of someone who enjoyed breaking people down for a living. I took my seat across from them, resting my hands flat on the table. I did not bring my own lawyer. In a deposition like this, bringing counsel would signal that I felt threatened, or that I had something to hide. More importantly, I knew the rules of evidence better than anyone in this room. Attorney Harrison leaned forward, pressing the record button on a small black device in the center of the table. He stated the date, the location, and the names of everyone present for the official record. Then he locked his dark eyes onto mine, and the psychological assault began. He started with the standard procedural questions establishing my name, my age, and my current address. Then he smoothly transitioned into the deeply personal territory they had specifically designed to trigger an emotional meltdown. "Let us talk about your childhood," Naomi Attorney Harrison said, keeping his voice deceptively soft and conversational. "Is it true that you were left in the care of your grandfather Jeremiah when you were only 4 months old?" "Yes, that is correct," I answered, my voice completely flat. "And your biological parents, Calvin and Denise, moved to Atlanta shortly after, correct? They established a new life, a new business, and eventually had another daughter, your sister Chloe." Harrison paused, letting the silence stretch before delivering his blow. "How did that make you feel, Naomi? Being left behind in South Chicago while your family built a beautiful, wealthy life without you?" "I am here to discuss the legal administration of my grandfather's estate," I replied evenly. My childhood feelings are irrelevant to the financial facts. They are highly relevant. Naomi Harrison countered, his voice growing sharper. We are establishing your state of mind. It is perfectly natural for an abandoned child to harbor deep-seated resentment. You watched your sister grow up with two loving parents in a privileged environment. You must have felt incredibly jealous. You must have felt an overwhelming sense of anger toward the people sitting across from you right now. He was trying to build a narrative for the transcript. If this case ever went to trial, a jury would read this deposition. Harrison wanted to paint a picture of a bitter, vindictive woman who had spent 35 years plotting revenge against her own flesh and blood. He wanted me to yell at my parents. He wanted me to cry about feeling unloved. I looked directly at Calvin and Denise. They were watching me intently, practically holding their breath, waiting for me to explode. Denise even reached up and dabbed the corner of her eye with a tissue, playing the role of the heartbroken mother forced to listen to her damaged child. I did not feel anger, I stated simply. I felt adequately provided for by my grandfather. He ensured I had a stable home, an excellent education, and a strong moral foundation. Harrison scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. Physical provision is one thing, but emotional manipulation is another. Did you not use your status as the abandoned child to guilt your grandfather into isolating himself? Did you not constantly remind him of how terrible your parents supposedly were in order to secure your position as his sole confidant? I never spoke ill of Calvin or Denise to my grandfather, I answered calmly. Their absence spoke entirely for itself. He formed his own opinions based on their failure to maintain contact. That is a very convenient answer, Harrison sneered, leaning across the table. But the truth is, you weaponized your childhood trauma. You saw an elderly man whose mind was slowly failing, and you took advantage of his guilt. You became his gatekeeper. You screened his phone calls. You turned away visitors. You systematically poisoned his mind against his own biological son, so that when the time came, you could claim total control of his $4 million empire. You stole this family's legacy out of pure spite. It was a brilliant legal trap. The average person accused of such vile, calculating behavior would immediately become defensive. They would start over-explaining, raising their voice, and accidentally volunteering unnecessary information. They would let their ego take the wheel and drive them right off a cliff. But I was a federal forensic investigator. I had sat across the table from cartel money launderers and corrupt corporate executives. I knew that the golden rule of surviving a hostile deposition was to answer the exact question asked with the fewest words possible and to never, ever show emotion. No, I replied. My voice did not waver. I did not blink. Just no. Harrison asked, raising an eyebrow. You expect us to believe that you, a woman entirely estranged from her parents, harbored absolutely no ill will, that you never once tried to influence Jeremiah's financial decisions to punish them. I expect you to present evidence of financial interference if you have it, I said, holding his gaze. Otherwise, my answer remains no. Harrison stared at me for a long moment, realizing that his psychological warfare was bouncing off a brick wall. He could not make me look like an unhinged, bitter child on the transcript. I was giving him absolutely nothing to work with. Preston shifted in his chair, clearly frustrated that I was not crying or screaming. He leaned over and whispered something into Harrison's ear. Harrison nodded, a slow, predatory smile creeping back onto his face. He opened the thick manila folder resting on the table in front of him. Very well, Naomi Harrison said, pulling out a stack of printed documents. If you insist on denying your emotional manipulation, let us move on to the documented proof of your grandfather's severe cognitive decline. Let us look at exactly how easily he was controlled. He slid the papers across the mahogany table toward me. The trap had failed, so now they were moving to their next desperate tactic. They were about to introduce their forged evidence onto the official legal record, and I was more than ready to watch them commit federal perjury. I looked down at the stack of papers Attorney Harrison pushed across the polished wood. The top sheet was a printed email supposedly sent from my grandfather's personal account to his primary care physician. The date was stamped nearly 2 years ago. Harrison began reading the email out loud for the court reporter, making sure every syllable was recorded. The words painted a pathetic and heartbreaking picture. The writer claimed he was constantly confused, that he could not remember where he put his checkbook, and that his granddaughter Naomi was the only one who could make sense of his daily life. The next email, supposedly sent to his estate lawyer, was even worse. It explicitly stated he felt terrified of my temper, that I was pressuring him to cut Calvin out of his life, and begged the lawyer for advice on how to keep me happy so I would not abandon him in a nursing home. It was a disgusting fabrication. Pops was a man who read the Financial Times every single morning until the week he passed. He did not use words like appease or frightened. He certainly did not ask for permission to spend his own money. But the tone of the emails was just convincing enough to fool a stranger or a judge who had never met him. Preston leaned forward, interlacing his fingers and resting his elbows on the mahogany table. He simply could not resist taking the spotlight to show off his perceived brilliance. "I had my lead engineers run a deep dive data recovery on the estate network," Preston stated proudly, puffing out his chest. "Pops had a local server that crashed last year. Naomi probably thought these emails were permanently deleted when she wiped his computer to cover her tracks. But in the tech sector, we know that nothing is ever truly gone. I personally extracted these files from the fragmented drive using proprietary software from my startup. I kept my face entirely blank, but inside my mind was running 1,000 miles a minute, analyzing every single flaw in his statement." Preston was lying through his teeth. Pops did not have a local server. He had an ancient desktop computer that he barely used for anything other than checking baseball scores and printing out recipes. There was no estate network to run a deep dive on. Preston had used his failing Silicon Valley artificial intelligence software to generate these emails. He fed a few real samples of my grandfather's writing into a large language model and commanded it to spit out a narrative of dementia and elder abuse. He was using the very same fake AI technology that got him sued by his private equity investors to try and steal my grandfather's legacy. Preston was so blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate need to feel superior that he made fatal technical errors. A standard tax accountant might just see printed text and panic. But a federal forensic accountant knows that digital communication leaves a microscopic, indestructible fingerprint. I could already see glaring anomalies just by glancing at the printed headers on the physical paper. The IP routing addresses listed at the top of the pages belonged to a commercial data center in California, not a residential internet provider in South Chicago. The timestamps were perfectly uniform, generated in exact 30-minute intervals, which was a classic, unmistakable signature of an automated batch creation process. He actually thought a woman who spent her career tracking encrypted cryptocurrency across international borders would not recognize a basic ChatGPT prompt slapped onto a fake email header. He thought his whiteness and his expensive suit made his code bulletproof. But I was not going to point out his sloppy coding right now. I needed him to formally tie his own noose. I needed the court reporter to capture every single word of his lie. I picked up the stack of emails and looked directly at Preston. "You are stating for the official record that you personally extracted these specific emails from my grandfather's computer?" I asked, making sure my voice was loud and clear for the stenograph machine. "Absolutely," Preston smirked, leaning back in his leather chair, crossing his legs. "I supervised the entire data recovery process myself. I can vouch for the cryptographic hash of every single file. They are 100% authentic and untampered with. I am a tech CEO, Naomi. I know exactly what I'm looking at." "And you are submitting these documents as factual evidence of my grandfather's mental state?" I asked, turning my attention back to Attorney Harrison. Harrison nodded, looking incredibly satisfied with how the deposition was going. "We are. These documents clearly demonstrate a pattern of severe cognitive decline and extreme dependency. They prove you were acting as his sole gatekeeper, isolating him from his biological son, and directly manipulating his finances. Denise let out another heavy, dramatic sigh, wrapping her silk scarf tighter around her shoulders. "It breaks my heart to see how much fear my father was living in," she whispered, shaking her head mournfully. "You kept him locked away like a prisoner, Naomi. You manipulated a sick old man all for a paycheck." Calvin chimed in, pointing a stern finger at me across the table. "You thought you covered your tracks. You thought because you crunch numbers for a living you could outsmart us. But you forgot my son-in-law is a tech genius. You cannot hide from the algorithms. We have the proof of what you did to my father, and we are going to make sure the judge sees every single page of it." I carefully placed the stack of forged emails back onto the table, aligning the edges perfectly. They were so incredibly confident. They truly believed they had executed a brilliant high-tech checkmate. They had just sworn under oath on a recorded federal transcript that they discovered and verified completely fabricated evidence. They had just escalated their petty civil dispute into felony perjury and federal fraud. I looked at the court reporter, ensuring her fingers were still flying across the keys capturing their confessions. Then I looked back at Attorney Harrison. "I have no further comments regarding these documents," I said smoothly. "If you intend to submit them to the probate court, I welcome the opportunity to have them independently verified by a digital forensics expert during the official hearing." Harrison smiled a cold, victorious smile. "Oh, we absolutely will submit them, Naomi. You can count on it." The deposition concluded shortly after. They packed up their briefcases, chatting amongst themselves with the relaxed energy of a team that had just won a championship game. Chloe even shot me a pitying look as she linked arms with Preston. They walked out of the conference room, leaving me sitting alone at the large mahogany table. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out my encrypted phone. They thought they had backed me into a corner with their fake data. They did not realize they had just handed me the final piece of evidence I needed to send them all to federal prison. I sat in the empty conference room listening to the heavy glass doors click shut behind them. The silence in the room was a stark contrast to the arrogant chatter that had just filled it. I opened my encrypted phone, but my mind immediately replayed the trap I had just successfully executed. They had walked out of here thinking they had won, because I intentionally let them win the battle to secure my ultimate victory in the war. During the final hour of that deposition, I had deliberately changed my body language. I knew I was sitting in a room with a ruthless attorney and 3 desperate criminals. If I fought back too hard, if I pointed out the glaring technical errors in their forged emails, or the impossible timeline of their handwritten will, right then and there they would panic. They would consult their expensive lawyer, withdraw the fake documents, and try to find another less obvious way to steal the estate. I could not let them do that. I needed them to feel completely invincible so they would permanently lock themselves into their own lies. So I put on a calculated performance. I let my shoulders slump forward. I lowered my gaze to my hands resting on the mahogany table. I allowed my voice to lose its sharp professional edge and take on a soft, defeated tone. I let my sentences trail off and looked away when Harrison raised his voice. I played the exact role they expected me to play, the broken, abandoned daughter who was finally realizing she was entirely outmatched. My performance worked flawlessly. Attorney Harrison, seeing what he believed was my spirit breaking, had pushed aggressively for final confirmations. Like a shark smelling blood in the water, he wanted to nail my coffin shut and wrap up his billable hours. I vividly remembered the sound of the court reporter's fingers flying across the stenograph machine as Harrison turned to my parents and Preston to establish the official chain of custody for their fake evidence. Harrison had asked Denise to formally state under oath the exact date she first saw the holographic will. Denise, with a triumphant gleam in her eye, placed her hand flat on the table and swore on the record that Pops had mailed it to her in Atlanta on October 15th. She explicitly stated she recognized his personal stationery and his favorite blue ink. She lied effortlessly, completely unaware that by tying herself to that specific date, she had just verified her involvement in a federal crime that aligned perfectly with her eviction notice. Then Harrison had focused on Preston. He asked Preston to swear under penalty of perjury that he personally extracted those damning emails from a local network drive at my grandfather's house. Preston had puffed out his chest, adjusted his expensive tie, and enthusiastically affirmed it. He testified that the digital timestamps were absolute and unedited. He legally bound himself to a fabricated digital footprint that my federal software had already proven originated from a commercial server farm in California. Finally, Calvin had sworn on the Holy Bible that the handwriting on the will was a perfect match to his late father's handwriting. He testified that Pops had been suffering from severe mental decline and could barely hold a coffee cup without shaking, yet somehow managed to write a flawless, legally binding document with perfect margins and complex legal terminology. I had sat there looking small and overwhelmed, offering absolutely no objections. I let them build a towering fortress of lies right there on the official legal transcript. Every single syllable was recorded, transcribed, and legally certified by the state. In my profession, we call this letting the suspect dig all the way to the bottom of the grave before you throw in the dirt. In the state of Illinois, committing perjury in a sworn deposition regarding an estate valued over $1 million is not a simple misdemeanor. It is a severe felony carrying mandatory state prison time, and conspiracy to commit fraud against a federal employee escalated the matter to an entirely different jurisdiction. I tapped the screen of my encrypted phone and pulled up the contact file for my Division Chief Director Hughes. I drafted a highly secure message requesting a formal evidence hold on the upcoming probate court hearing. I attached the preliminary forensic reports and the digital tracking logs. I did not need to investigate my family anymore. The investigation was officially over. Now it was purely about the execution. I packed my laptop back into my briefcase and stood up from the heavy mahogany table. I smoothed down the front of my gray suit. The feeling of being an abandoned child, the sting of their cruel words, the public humiliation they had tried to inflict on me online, all of it washed away. It was replaced by the cold, hard precision of justice. They had walked out of this building thinking they were walking toward a massive $4 million payday. In reality, they were walking straight into the jaws of a federal trap they had built with their own hands. I walked out of the conference room and took the elevator down to the busy Chicago streets. The gray clouds overhead were finally beginning to break, letting thin rays of sunlight hit the pavement. As I stepped toward the curb to hail a car, my personal phone vibrated in my pocket. It was an unknown number, but I already knew exactly who it was. The deposition was over, but the desperation of people running out of time and money never sleeps. They had secured their fake evidence on the record, but they still needed immediate cash to hold off their creditors before the judge made a final ruling. I answered the call without saying a word, waiting for the panic on the other end to reveal itself. Chloe's voice came through the speaker sounding uncharacteristically nervous and completely dropping her usual arrogant tone. She asked if we could meet privately at a coffee shop away from the lawyers and our parents. The trap was set, the record was sealed, and now the rats were starting to scramble. I agreed to meet Chloe at a high-end artisanal coffee shop in the Gold Coast neighborhood. It was exactly the kind of pretentious, overpriced establishment she preferred, with minimalist decor and drinks that cost more than a minimum wage hourly shift. When I walked through the glass doors, she was already sitting at a small marble table in the back corner. She was wearing oversized designer sunglasses indoors, nervously tearing a sugar packet into tiny pieces. The confident sneer she wore at the deposition was completely gone. She looked like a woman who had just realized she was standing on a trapdoor. I ordered a simple black coffee and took the seat across from her. I did not say hello. I just sat there waiting for her to speak. Chloe took a shaky breath and removed her sunglasses. The dark circles under her eyes were visible even through her heavy makeup. Naomi, she started, her voice lacking its usual sharp, arrogant edge. I wanted to talk to you, just the two of us, without the lawyers and without Mom and Dad. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I am listening, I said flatly. She leaned forward, lowering her voice, as if she was sharing a profound secret. This whole legal battle is tearing the family apart, Naomi. It is getting ugly and nobody wants that. Mom is not sleeping, Dad is stressed out of his mind, and honestly I hate seeing you go through this. You looked so defeated in that deposition room today. We are sisters at the end of the day. We should not be fighting like this in public. It is embarrassing for all of us. The audacity was almost impressive. Less than 2 hours ago, she had sat in a conference room and watched her husband and parents commit federal perjury to steal my inheritance. Now she was sitting across from me, sipping an oat milk latte and pretending to care about my emotional well-being. She was playing the exact same manipulative game our mother played, but she lacked the experience to make it believable. I remained completely silent, letting the awkwardness of the heavy pause press down on her. Chloe shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She reached into her massive leather tote bag and pulled out a crisp rectangular piece of paper. She placed her manicured fingers on top of it and slid it slowly across the polished marble table, stopping right in front of my coffee cup. I looked down. It was a cashier's check made out to my name. The amount written on the line was exactly $50,000. Preston and I talked about it, Chloe said, trying to force a supportive smile. We know you do not have much, Naomi. We know losing the house is a huge shock. We want to help you get back on your feet. You can take this $50,000 right now. You can use it to put a down payment on a nice condo somewhere quiet. Start fresh. All you have to do is sign a waiver dropping your contest to the will. Let the probate judge validate the document on Friday so the estate can clear. Take the money, Naomi. Do not drag this out and make a fool of yourself in court. I stared at the piece of paper. $50,000. To the average person, it might seem like a generous olive branch, but to a forensic accountant, it was a glaring neon sign pointing directly to their absolute desperation. My mind instantly processed the mathematics of the situation. I knew Preston was overdrawn by $200,000. I knew Calvin and Denise were facing a $2.5 million tax lien and a Friday eviction. They did not have $50,000 sitting in a savings account to give away out of the goodness of their hearts. This check was either drawn from a predatory short-term loan with an astronomical interest rate, or Preston had managed to swindle one last desperate investor to keep his Ponzi scheme afloat for a few more days. They were offering me $50,000 to walk away from a $4 million estate because they were terrified. They needed the legal hold lifted by Friday, or they would completely lose everything. This check was not an olive branch. It was a bribe funded by pure panic. Chloe watched my face eagerly, waiting for me to snatch the check. She actually thought $50,000 would dazzle me. She thought because I lived a quiet life in South Chicago, I had never seen real money before. She assumed my silence was hesitation. I reached out and picked up the check. I held it between my index fingers and thumbs, feeling the thick security paper. Chloe smiled, a look of immense relief washing over her face. She thought she had won. She thought she had bought her way out of federal prison for pennies on the dollar. I looked her dead in the eyes, keeping my expression entirely blank. Then I pulled my hands apart. The sharp sound of the thick paper tearing cut through the soft jazz music playing in the coffee shop. Chloe's smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of pure horror. I tore the check in half, then I placed the two pieces together and tore them again into quarters. "What are you doing?" Chloe gasped loudly, her hands flying to her mouth. "That is $50,000. Are you insane?" I gathered the torn pieces of the bribe. The waitress happened to walk by at that exact moment, placing a small black leather booklet on the table containing the bill for our drinks. I placed the shredded remains of the $50,000 check neatly inside the booklet, right on top of the receipt. "I am not the one who is insane, Chloe," I said, my voice dangerously calm and precise. "I know exactly how much debt Preston is hiding. I know exactly what is happening to the house in Atlanta on Friday. And I know exactly what kind of paper a moleskin notebook uses." All the blood drained from Chloe's face. She stared at me, her mouth slightly open, unable to form a single word. The mention of the moleskin notebook, the specific brand of paper they use to forge the holographic, will hit her like a physical blow. She realized in that terrifying second that I knew absolutely everything. I had not been defeated in that deposition. I had been studying them. I stood up from the marble table and picked up my briefcase. I looked down at my trembling sister. "You and your husband have a very busy week ahead of you," I said, buttoning my suit jacket. "I suggest you save whatever cash you have left. You are going to need it for the commissary when the federal prosecutors are finished with you." I turned and walked out of the coffee shop into the bright afternoon sun, leaving Chloe sitting completely frozen in her chair, left to pay the $12 bill with the shredded remains of her pathetic bribe. By Thursday morning, the panic radiating from my family had morphed into reckless aggression. Chloe had undoubtedly run straight back to Preston and told him about the torn check. She must have told him the look on my face when I mentioned the moleskin notebook and how I knew the exact timeline of their financial ruin. Cornered animals do not surrender gracefully, they attack. Preston realized that if he could not buy my silence, he had to completely destroy my credibility before we stepped into a courtroom. He figured that if I was fired from my federal job in disgrace, my testimony in probate court would be rendered entirely worthless. A judge would simply view me as a corrupt, bitter woman who lost her career and was lashing out at her wealthy family. So Preston sat down at his computer and decided to play a very dangerous game of cyber warfare against the United States government. At exactly 8 in the morning, my encrypted phone vibrated. It was a secure priority message from Director Hughes, commanding me to report to his office at the federal building immediately. I put on my sharpest black suit, pinned my federal badge to my lapel, and took a car straight to the downtown headquarters. I bypassed the standard security checkpoints using my biometric clearance and took the private elevator up to the executive floor. When I walked into Director Hughes' office, he was standing by the window looking out over the city. On his large mahogany desk sat a thick red folder stamped with the seal of the Office of the Inspector General. "Take a seat," Naomi Hughes said, turning around. His face was entirely unreadable. I sat down in the leather chair, keeping my posture perfectly straight. Hughes picked up the red folder and slid it across the desk toward me. "At 2 o'clock this morning, the Internal Affairs Division received a massive anonymous whistleblower data dump." Hughes explained, his voice low and serious. "The sender claimed to be a concerned citizen exposing severe corruption within our ranks. The packet accuses you of embezzling federal funds utilizing classified government tracking software to stalk private citizens and illegally coercing an elderly man into signing over his estate. It included fabricated transaction logs, manipulated audio files, and doctored emails." I looked down at the red folder, but I did not open it. I did not need to. I knew exactly who had sent it. Preston was trying to deliver a fatal blow to my career. "If you were a rookie agent," Hughes continued, leaning against the edge of his desk, "you would have been stripped of your badge and suspended without pay the second you walked through that door, pending a full internal investigation." I looked up at him, meeting his gaze. "But I am not a rookie," I stated calmly. "No, you are not," Hughes replied, a faint smile finally breaking through his stern expression. "You are the forensic accountant who dismantled a tri-state cartel money laundering operation using nothing but tax discrepancies. You are my top investigator. And more importantly, the idiot who sent this anonymous tip made amateur mistakes that a first-year computer science student would be embarrassed by." Hughes opened the folder and flipped to the technical breakdown provided by our cybersecurity division. "The sender tried to route the data packet through a series of encrypted proxy servers in Switzerland to mask his location," Hughes explained, tapping a line of code on the paper. "But he was careless. He attached a PDF document containing the fake bank logs. He forgot to scrub the metadata. The document was generated using a registered software license tied directly to a corporate entity in San Jose, California. A corporate entity owned by my brother-in-law Preston." I finished the sentence for him. "Exactly," Hughes nodded. "He also included routing numbers in the fake bank statements that do not even exist in the Federal Reserve System. It is a sloppy, desperate attempt at character assassination." I felt a cold wave of absolute satisfaction wash over me. Preston was so blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate need to feel superior that he had just committed a massive unforced error. He thought he was a tech genius hacking the mainframe. He forgot he was dealing with the federal government. Sending forged documents to a federal agency in an attempt to trigger a false investigation is a direct violation of Title 18 United States Code, Section 1001. It is the federal crime of making false statements to government officials. It is a felony punishable by up to 5 years in federal prison. Preston had just handed me the rope to hang him with, and he tied the noose himself. Director Hughes closed the red folder and pushed it firmly into my hands. "The Inspector General has officially dismissed the complaint as baseless," Hughes said, walking back around to his chair. "However, since this was a targeted cyber attack against a federal agent using interstate communication lines, it is now classified as a federal crime. Consider this packet an official addition to your defensive investigation. Use it, Naomi." "Thank you, Director," I said, standing up and placing the red folder securely inside my briefcase. I walked out of the federal building with the heavy weight of the evidence grounding me. The sun was shining brightly over Chicago, but a massive storm was about to hit my family. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow was the day the probate court would hold the emergency hearing to validate the holographic will. Tomorrow was also the exact day Calvin and Denise were legally scheduled to be evicted from their Atlanta mansion, and the exact day Preston's investors were coming to collect their stolen money. They had tried to throw me out of my home. They had tried to destroy my reputation on the internet. They had tried to bribe me with dirty money, and when that failed, they tried to take away my career and my freedom. They had exhausted every single dirty trick in their playbook. They were completely out of ammunition. I pulled my phone out and requested a car service to take me back to my hotel. I had a long night ahead of me. I needed to print every single document, organize every timeline, and perfectly index the mountain of federal evidence I was going to drop on the judge's desk. The final battle was set. They thought they were walking into a courtroom tomorrow to claim a $4 million prize. I was going to make sure they walked out in handcuffs. I returned to the quiet sanctuary of my hotel room and immediately spread the contents of the red folder across the glass desk. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the room, but I did not bother turning on the lights. The glowing screens of my dual monitors provided all the illumination I needed. I had the bank records, the SEC filings, the IRS tax liens, and the failed cyber attack logs. I had built a perfect chronological timeline of their financial ruin and their desperate conspiracy. But as I stared at the date, October 15th, highlighted on my digital calendar, a sudden nagging thought interrupted my focus. October 15th was the day Preston claimed Pops wrote the holographic will. It was also the day Calvin and Denise received their eviction notice. I had already proven the document was forged based on the manufacturing date of the moleskin paper and the fabricated AI emails. But a good forensic accountant knows that circumstantial evidence, while powerful, is always vulnerable to a slick defense attorney. Harrison could argue that Preston simply made a mistake about the date or the paper brand. To guarantee a prison sentence, I needed to place them at the scene of the crime. I needed to know exactly what happened in my grandfather's house on that specific Tuesday in October. I closed my eyes and pictured the living room of the South Chicago brownstone. I visualized the antique furniture, the heavy curtains, and the large stone fireplace. Then I remembered a seemingly insignificant detail from 6 years ago. In the winter of 2018, there was a string of burglaries in our neighborhood. Pops was fiercely protective of his property. He did not trust the standard alarm companies, so he hired an independent security contractor to wire the house. Everyone knew about the cameras on the front porch and the back patio, but what nobody else knew was that Pops had insisted on installing a covert camera inside the house, pointing directly at the living room and the hallway leading to his home office. He had hidden a microscopic lens inside the hollowed-out frame of the vintage grandfather clock. He used to joke with me that he wanted to know exactly which one of his poker buddies was sneaking extra slices of pie from the kitchen when he was not looking. Pops connected that hidden camera to a private encrypted cloud server he paid for annually in cash. My eyes snapped open. I pulled my keyboard close and opened a secure browsing terminal. If Preston had actually done a real data sweep of the house network like he bragged about in the deposition, he would have found the local router. But Preston was a fraud who only knew how to run fake AI scripts. He would never think to check for a standalone encrypted network. I navigated to the hosting provider's portal. I needed the login credentials. Pops was a creature of intense habit. He never wrote his passwords down on paper, and he never used his own birthday. I typed in the email address I had set up for him years ago. For the password, I thought about the two things he loved most in this world: his favorite hymn and the year he took me in. I typed Amazing Grace, followed by 1989. The screen flashed green. Access granted. My heart beat a little faster as a directory of video files populated the screen. The files were organized by year, month, and day. I scrolled past the endless weeks of mundane footage. Pops reading his newspaper, Pops watching baseball, Pops falling asleep in his favorite armchair. I navigated down to October of the current year and clicked on the folder for the 15th. The video player loaded. The footage was in crisp, high-definition color with a perfectly clear audio feed. The timestamp in the corner read 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The camera angle provided a wide, sweeping view of the living room and the adjacent dining area. Pops was not in the room. He had been confined to his medical bed upstairs during those final weeks. Instead, the screen showed Calvin, Denise, Preston, and Chloe standing around the heavy mahogany dining table. They had let themselves into the house while I was at work. I put on my headphones and turned the volume all the way up. I cannot believe we have to do this. Calvin was pacing back and forth, running his hands over his face. The landlord said, "Friday. Denise. Friday. The sheriff is going to put our furniture on the street. We are completely out of time." Denise was sitting at the table, her face twisted in a harsh, ugly scowl. She did not look like the grieving mother from the TikTok video. "Well, what do you want me to do, Calvin?" she snapped. "The old man is taking too long. The doctor said his heart was failing months ago, but he just keeps holding on. It is incredibly selfish. He is sitting on $4 million, while his own son is about to be homeless." My blood ran completely cold. I stopped breathing. I was listening to my biological parents actively complain that my grandfather was not dying fast enough to solve their financial problems. Preston walked into the frame, pulling a familiar black moleskin notebook from his designer jacket. He tossed it onto the table. "Complaining is not going to liquidate his assets," Preston said, his voice dripping with his usual arrogance. "The venture capital guys are threatening to break my legs. We need legal control of the estate before he actually dies so we can authorize emergency wire transfers." I printed a sample of his handwriting from a birthday card I found in his desk. "Chloe read the legal template I sent you." Chloe pulled out her phone and started dictating the exact wording of the holographic will. Preston sat down at the table, uncapped a blue pen, and began slowly and meticulously forging my grandfather's handwriting on the notebook paper. They were literally committing felony fraud on high-definition video. But the horror did not stop there. Calvin stopped pacing and looked up at the ceiling toward the second floor where Pops was sleeping. "He is supposed to take his beta blockers at 3 o'clock, Calvin said, his voice dropping to a sinister whisper. "The nurse comes at 5. If Naomi does not get home until 6, nobody would know if he missed a dose. The stress of a missed pill on a weak heart. It would just look like nature finally taking its course." Denise looked at Calvin, her eyes cold and calculating. She did not express shock. She did not tell her husband he was talking about murder. She simply nodded. "Nature takes its course," she agreed smoothly. "And we take the house. It is the only way to save our legacy." I slammed my hand down on the spacebar, pausing the video. The silence in my hotel room was deafening. My stomach violently churned, and I had to grip the edge of the glass desk to keep my hands from shaking. They were not just thieves. They were not just liars and frauds. They had conspired to withhold vital heart medication from an elderly man to accelerate his death. They had actively plotted to kill him for his money. Pops had survived that day only because the home health nurse had arrived early, completely throwing off their sickening plan. A cold, dark rage settled deep into my bones. It completely erased any lingering trace of familial obligation or pity I might have subconsciously held on to. This was no longer just a defensive maneuver to protect my assets or my career. This was absolute warfare. I downloaded the entire video file verifying the cryptographic hash to ensure it would hold up in any federal court in the country. I backed it up to 3 separate encrypted drives. I looked at my reflection in the dark monitor screen. The woman staring back at me was no longer just a forensic accountant. I was the executioner. They had walked into my grandfather's house and planned his murder while forging the document they planned to use against me tomorrow. I packed the drives into my briefcase with clinical precision. Tomorrow morning I was going to walk into that probate courtroom and I was going to tear their entire world apart piece by piece. Friday morning arrived with a biting chill that swept through the concrete canyons of downtown Chicago, but inside the Cook County Probate Court, the air was thick and suffocating. The courtroom was a grand cavernous space with high vaulted ceilings and dark oak paneling that absorbed the nervous whispers of the gallery. I walked down the center aisle wearing a tailored charcoal suit, carrying the heavy leather briefcase that held the absolute destruction of my biological family. I took my seat at the defense table next to Attorney Caldwell, a sharp veteran litigator I had retained specifically for this final stage of the trap. He was a quiet man who understood the power of letting the opposition exhaust their ammunition before returning fire. Across the aisle, sitting at the petitioner's table, my family looked incredibly confident. Calvin was wearing his best conservative suit. Denise had her hair pulled back into a modest bun, completely abandoning her usual flashy Atlanta aesthetic to look like a humble, grieving daughter. Preston sat between them, looking like a smug corporate raider, ready to finalize a hostile takeover. Chloe was sitting in the front row of the gallery, surrounded by several of our extended family members and church elders who had come to watch me lose everything. The heavy wooden door behind the bench swung open, and the bailiff announced the arrival of the Honorable Judge Higgins. We all stood as she took her seat. Judge Higgins was a formidable black woman in her late 50s, known throughout the courthouse for her brilliant legal mind and her absolute intolerance for courtroom theatrics. She adjusted her reading glasses, looked down at the case file, and signaled for Attorney Harrison to call his first witness. Harrison stood up confidently, buttoning his suit jacket. "Your Honor, we call Denise to the stand." Denise stood up slowly, keeping her head slightly bowed. She walked to the witness box, raised her right hand, and swore to tell the whole truth. It was the exact same lie she had told in the deposition, but today she had a much larger audience. Harrison approached the podium, resting his hands on the edges. "Please state your relationship to the deceased for the record." "He was my father," Denise answered, her voice trembling perfectly on cue. A soft, collective sigh of sympathy rippled through the family members sitting in the gallery behind me. Harrison guided her through her carefully crafted narrative. Denise looked directly at Judge Higgins, playing the role of the heartbroken mother who had made an impossible sacrifice. She spoke about how she left me in Chicago so I could have stability while she struggled to build a life. Then she smoothly transitioned into the vicious lies about my behavior. "When my father's health began to fail, I tried to be there," Denise said, pulling a tissue from her pocket and dabbing her dry eyes. "But Naomi made it impossible. She changed the locks on the house. She blocked my phone number from his cell phone. She fired his regular nurses and took complete control of his medication. Every time I managed to get him on the phone, he sounded terrified. He told me Naomi screamed at him if he even mentioned my name." Harrison nodded sympathetically, letting the heavy silence linger in the courtroom so her words could sink in. "And did your father ever express a desire to change his estate plans to protect himself from this abuse?" "Yes," Denise sobbed, her shoulders shaking. "He told me he realized his mistake. He told me he wanted his legacy to go to his real family, not the daughter who was keeping him prisoner in his own home." He mailed me a handwritten will just weeks before he died, begging us to step in and save him. The gallery murmured loudly. Aunt Shirley was shaking her head, glaring at the back of my neck. Denise was giving the performance of a lifetime. She painted me as a monster who preyed on a sick elderly man, using my professional knowledge to trap him in a financial and emotional cage. Judge Higgins listened intently, her face a mask of judicial neutrality, taking careful notes on her legal pad. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded on the table. I did not glare at Denise. I did not shake my head in denial. I simply let her build her towering monument of perjury. Harrison thanked her, and Denise stepped down from the stand, walking back to her seat with the heavy steps of a grieving victim. "Your Honor," Harrison announced, his voice booming with authority. "We now call Preston to the stand to verify the execution of the final will and testament." Preston practically leaped out of his chair. He practically strutted to the witness box, raising his right hand with a crisp, confident motion. He wore a tailored navy suit with a subtle, expensive watch flashing on his wrist. He wanted to project the image of a highly successful Silicon Valley chief executive who was simply taking time out of his busy schedule to handle a minor family dispute. Harrison approached the witness box and handed Preston the clear plastic sleeve containing the blue ink document. "Can you identify this document for the court?" "Yes," Preston replied, leaning into the microphone so his voice echoed clearly across the room. "This is the holographic will written and signed by Jeremiah on October 15th of this year. I was personally present when he drafted it." Judge Higgins peered over her glasses at Preston. "You were physically present in the room when the deceased wrote this document?" "Absolutely, Your Honor," Preston answered, flashing a charming professional smile. "Pops and I had a very close relationship. He respected my business acumen. On that particular afternoon, I visited him at his home. He was entirely lucid. In fact, we were discussing market volatility and real estate portfolio optimization. He expressed deep concern that his current estate setup lacked the necessary fiduciary agility for the modern market. He was throwing corporate buzzwords around like confetti, hoping to blind the judge with his vocabulary. He actually wanted the court to believe that an 80-year-old retired landlord from South Chicago was discussing fiduciary agility and portfolio optimization. Pops told me he wanted a dynamic executor to handle the asset reallocation. Preston continued, entirely oblivious to how ridiculous he sounded. He pulled out a moleskin notebook from his desk drawer. He specifically chose that brand because he liked the thick archival paper. He wrote out his final wishes in his own handwriting, signing it right in front of me. He wanted Calvin and Chloe to inherit the liquid assets and properties, and he explicitly named me as the sole executor to ensure the transition was handled by a professional. "And was he acting under any duress?" Harrison asked, teeing up the final point. "None at all," Preston stated firmly. He was relieved. He was finally taking his power back from Naomi. He handed the document to me and asked me to mail it to Denise for safekeeping. Harrison turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we submit this holographic will into evidence. The testimony proves it was drafted by a man of sound mind who recognized the severe emotional and financial abuse he was suffering under the respondent." Preston stepped down from the stand, returning to his seat with a triumphant smirk. He looked at me and gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod of victory. He thought he had completely won. He had established the timeline, verified the document, and assassinated my character, all under oath. Harrison walked back to his podium to deliver his closing demand. "Your Honor, the evidence is overwhelming. We formally request that you validate this holographic will immediately. We request that Preston be granted full executive control over all bank accounts and real estate holdings. Furthermore, given the disturbing testimony regarding Naomi's isolating behavior, we ask the court to permanently strip her of any claims to this estate and refer her actions to the state's attorney for a formal investigation into elder abuse." Harrison sat down. The courtroom was dead silent. The family in the gallery watched me with triumphant, vindictive eyes. Calvin leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. They had pushed me all the way to the edge of the cliff. Judge Higgins turned her gaze to my table. Attorney Caldwell, the judge, said, her voice echoing in the quiet room. Do you wish to cross-examine these witnesses or present a defense? Attorney Caldwell stood up slowly and buttoned his suit jacket. He did not look panicked. He did not grab a stack of papers. He simply looked at Attorney Harrison and offered a polite, chilling smile. Your Honor, we have no desire to cross-examine the petitioners, Caldwell said calmly. Their statements on the record are perfectly clear. Instead, the defense calls Naomi to the stand. Harrison immediately jumped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. The respondent cannot simply take the stand to offer self-serving denials. She has no independent witnesses to corroborate her claims. She does not need an independent witness, Caldwell replied, his voice smooth as glass. She is not taking the stand solely as the respondent. We are calling her as an expert witness. Harrison let out a loud scoff. An expert witness. In what? Stealing from the elderly. Attorney Caldwell looked at the judge, ignoring Harrison's outburst entirely. Your Honor, Naomi is a Level 5 federal forensic accountant for the United States government specializing in corporate fraud, asset tracing, and digital document verification. She holds active federal clearance and has testified as an expert witness in over 40 federal fraud convictions. We ask the court to recognize her credentials so she may present a forensic analysis of the petitioner's evidence. The color instantly drained from Preston's face. Calvin dropped his arms, uncrossing them as a sudden wave of panic washed over him. They had completely forgotten who they were dealing with. They thought I was just the quiet sister who did taxes. They had no idea I destroyed corporate empires for a living. Judge Higgins looked at the credentials Caldwell submitted, then looked at Harrison. The witness is highly qualified counselor. Objection overruled. Naomi, please take the stand. I stood up from the table. I picked up my heavy leather briefcase. I walked past Calvin, who was suddenly sweating profusely. I walked past Preston, whose smug smile had completely collapsed into an expression of sheer terror. I stepped up into the witness box, placed my hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. I set my briefcase down on the ledge and snapped the metal locks open. The loud clicks echoed through the silent courtroom like the cocking of a loaded weapon. They had spent the entire morning building a beautiful, fragile house of cards. It was finally time for me to strike the match and burn it to the ground. Attorney Caldwell walked slowly toward the witness box, holding his legal pad. He did not raise his voice or attempt any theatrical gestures. He simply looked at me with the calm, focused demeanor of a professional ready to dismantle a lie. Naomi, in your capacity as a federal forensic accountant, you are frequently called upon to verify the authenticity of financial and legal documents. Correct? Caldwell asked. That is correct, I answered, my voice carrying clearly across the silent courtroom. I specialize in identifying fraudulent documentation, money laundering schemes, and asset concealment. Caldwell turned to the judge. Your Honor, the defense requests that the original holographic will submitted by the petitioners be handed to the witness for expert examination. Judge Higgins nodded sharply toward the bailiff. The bailiff retrieved the clear plastic sleeve from the evidence table and handed it to me. I took the document and carefully slid the single piece of paper out of the sleeve. I held it up under the bright fluorescent lights of the witness box. I could feel the eyes of every single person in the room burning into me. Preston was sitting at the petitioner's table, a smug grin still plastered on his face. He truly believed his fake AI emails and his expensive pen had created an impenetrable forgery. Can you tell the court what you are holding? Naomi Caldwell asked. I am holding a single sheet of dot-grid archival paper torn from a Moleskine brand notebook, I explained, running my thumb along the perforated edge. The petitioner Preston testified under oath just moments ago that he physically watched my grandfather write this document on October 15th. He explicitly noted my grandfather's preference for this specific brand of paper. And do you find any inconsistencies with that sworn testimony? Caldwell prompted. I find a physical impossibility, I stated flatly, lowering the paper and looking directly at Preston. Moleskine manufactures millions of notebooks, but they serialize their specialty editions. If you look closely at the bottom right corner of this page, there is a very faint micro-printed serial code embedded in the dot grid. This specific code identifies this paper as part of their Winter Holiday Limited Edition collection. I paused, letting the silence stretch for a fraction of a second before delivering the fatal blow. This specific winter edition notebook was not shipped to retail stores or available for online purchase until November 1st. It is physically impossible for my grandfather to have written on this piece of paper on October 15th. Unless the petitioner is claiming my grandfather possessed a time machine, this document is a complete forgery, manufactured weeks after the date written at the top of the page. The smug grin on Preston's face vanished instantly, entirely replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him pale and sweating. He opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no words came out. Attorney Harrison jumped to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness is offering expert testimony on commercial paper manufacturing without prior disclosure." Judge Higgins slammed her gavel down, her eyes flashing with anger. "Overruled, Counselor. You opened the door to this line of questioning when your client explicitly testified about the specific brand of the notebook to bolster his credibility. The witness is simply verifying his claim." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a certified letter from the Moleskine Corporate Distribution Office. I handed it to the bailiff. "This is an affidavit from the manufacturer confirming the release date of this specific paper batch," I said. "The document is a fraud." A loud collective gasp swept through the gallery. Aunt Shirley loudly whispered a prayer. Calvin gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning completely white. They had built their entire legal strategy on a piece of paper that was fundamentally flawed from the moment it was manufactured. But a forged document was only the beginning. I was not just going to prove they lied. I was going to prove exactly why they lied. Attorney Caldwell stepped closer to the witness box. "Naomi, in your professional experience, people do not commit felony forgery without a significant motivating factor. Did you conduct a forensic audit of the petitioner's financial records to determine a motive?" "I did," I replied, pulling a thick stack of federal documents from my briefcase. "I investigated the corporate and personal finances of both Preston and my biological parents, Calvin and Denise. What I found was a pattern of severe financial desperation." I held up the first heavily redacted file. Preston testified that he is a successful tech executive seeking to optimize my grandfather's portfolio. In reality, his Silicon Valley startup is a registered shell corporation. According to these certified documents from the Securities and Exchange Commission, Preston is currently under active federal investigation for operating a Ponzi scheme. His corporate accounts are overdrawn by exactly $200,000, and he is facing aggressive civil litigation from defrauded private equity investors. Harrison turned and glared at Preston. You could see the realization hitting the high-priced lawyer. His clients had completely lied to him, and now he was standing in the middle of a federal perjury trap. I then held up the second stack of documents featuring the harsh red seal of the Internal Revenue Service. As for Calvin and Denise, they are not the wealthy Atlanta socialites they pretend to be. I continued, my voice ringing with cold authority. They have not paid federal income taxes in 6 years. The IRS has issued a massive tax lien against them, totaling $2.5 million. Furthermore, I have pulled the public court records from Fulton County, Georgia. Their leased mansion is currently under a foreclosure and eviction order. I turned and looked directly at Calvin and Denise. They were shrinking into their chairs, their faces masks of absolute humiliation. "That eviction order is scheduled to be executed by the local sheriff today," I stated. "This very afternoon." On Monday morning, Preston and Calvin walked into my grandfather's bank and demanded an emergency wire transfer of exactly $500,000. That is the exact combined amount required to temporarily halt the IRS seizure and pay off Preston's furious investors. They did not come to Chicago to mourn. They came to rob an estate to save themselves from federal prison and homelessness. The courtroom was in absolute chaos. The gallery erupted into furious whispers. Church elders who had glared at me an hour ago were now staring at Calvin and Denise with profound disgust. Judge Higgins banged her gavel repeatedly demanding order, but the sheer magnitude of the financial deception had shocked everyone in the room. Harrison slowly sat down. He did not offer an objection. He did not try to defend his clients. He simply closed his legal pad, realizing his career was in severe jeopardy just by being associated with them. Once the courtroom finally quieted down, Attorney Caldwell asked his final question. Naomi, physical evidence and financial motives are compelling, but do you have any direct evidence placing the petitioners at the scene of the forgery? I reached into my briefcase one last time. I pulled out a small encrypted federal flash drive. I do, I said, holding it up. I handed the drive to the bailiff and requested that it be connected to the courtroom's audio-visual system. Two large flat-screen monitors descended from the ceiling facing the judge and the gallery. My grandfather was a very cautious man, I explained to the court. 6 years ago, he installed a covert high-definition security camera inside the hollowed-out frame of the grandfather clock in his living room. It was connected to a private encrypted cloud server. The petitioners did not know it existed. I retrieved the footage from October 15th, the exact day they claim my grandfather wrote his will. The video filled the screens. The picture was incredibly sharp, capturing the living room bathed in afternoon sunlight. There on the screen were Calvin, Denise, Chloe, and Preston standing around the dining table. The courtroom listened in absolute stunned silence as the audio played. They heard Calvin pacing frantically, complaining that the landlord was going to throw them on the street by Friday. They heard Denise, the woman who had just cried on the witness stand about her deep love for her father, coldly complain that he was taking too long to die. I watched the faces of my extended family in the gallery. Aunt Shirley pressed her hand over her mouth, tears of genuine horror streaming down her face. Then the video showed Preston pulling the moleskin notebook out of his jacket and sitting down at the table. The entire courtroom watched as Preston meticulously forged my grandfather's handwriting while Chloe read the legal template from her phone. They were watching a felony being committed in real time. But the final crushing blow came next. The audio picked up Calvin's voice dropping to a sinister whisper. The entire courtroom heard him suggest skipping Pop's 3 o'clock dose of beta blockers. They heard him explicitly state that the stress of a missed pill on a weak heart would look like nature taking its course. They heard him actively plot to withhold life-saving medication to accelerate an elderly man's death. And they watched Denise nod in agreement. Nature takes its course, she had said on the video. And we take the house. Judge Higgins' face was a portrait of pure, absolute fury. She stared at the frozen image on the screen, her jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might shatter. The silence in the courtroom was no longer just shocked. It was completely terrified. Denise buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. But these were not the fake tears of a victim. These were the tears of a woman who knew her life was entirely over. Calvin sat perfectly still, staring blankly ahead, looking like a man marching to his own execution. Chloe was hyperventilating in the front row of the gallery, shrinking away from the furious glares of our relatives. I sat in the witness box, perfectly calm. I had taken their insults, their fake eviction, their public smear campaign, and their psychological warfare. I had absorbed every single punch they threw, and in return, I had just completely dismantled their entire existence on the permanent legal record. The masks were completely ripped away, and the ugly, terrifying truth was laid bare for the whole world to see. The silence in the courtroom was finally broken by the sound of Attorney Harrison desperately shuffling his papers. He stood up, his hands visibly shaking, leaning heavily against his podium. He knew he was standing on the edge of a massive legal malpractice cliff, and he was trying to salvage whatever tiny fragment of the case he could. "Your Honor," Harrison stammered, his voice completely stripped of its former confidence. "The petitioners formally withdraw the holographic will from consideration. We concede that the document is invalid. However, the core issue of the estate remains. If there is no valid will, the laws of intestate succession must apply." As the sole surviving biological son, my client Calvin is legally entitled to inherit the entirety of his father's estate. He was actually trying to pivot. After being caught on high-definition video forging a document and plotting to withhold heart medication, they still thought the law would simply hand them $4 million by default because of biological bloodlines. Calvin slowly raised his head, a faint glimmer of desperate hope returning to his eyes. He thought that even if he was going to prison, he would at least have the money to pay for a high-priced criminal defense attorney. Attorney Caldwell did not even bother to stand up. He just looked at me and nodded. Naomi Caldwell said smoothly, "Could you please clarify the current financial structure of your grandfather's assets?" I looked directly at Calvin, watching that tiny spark of hope in his eyes. "I am afraid the laws of intestate succession will not help the petitioners," I stated, my voice echoing clearly across the room. "Because there is absolutely no estate to inherit." Harrison furrowed his brow, stepping away from the podium. "What do you mean there is no estate? We have the property appraisals. We know the liquid accounts hold over $4 million. I reached into my briefcase one last time. I pulled out a thick, bound legal document bearing the official seal of the state of Illinois. "My grandfather was a brilliant man," I explained, holding the document up for the judge to see. "He knew exactly who his biological son was. He knew Calvin was reckless, greedy, and heavily in debt. Pops knew that leaving a traditional will would only invite a massive legal battle after his death. So 10 years ago, he hired a team of estate planners to completely remove his assets from the probate process entirely." I handed the bound document to the bailiff, who passed it up to Judge Higgins. 10 years ago, I continued, Pops transferred the deeds to the South Chicago house, all of his commercial real estate properties, and every single dollar of his liquid wealth into an irrevocable trust. He surrendered his personal ownership of those assets while he was still alive. When he passed away last weekend, his personal estate was worth exactly $84.12, sitting in an isolated checking account. I turned to look at my family. "You spent thousands of dollars on attorney fees. You committed federal perjury. You forged legal documents. You conspired to commit elder abuse. And you did it all to steal a $4 million estate that has not legally existed for a decade." Calvin's jaw dropped open, his chest heaving, as the reality of my words crashed down on him. "And who is the named beneficiary and trustee of this irrevocable trust?" Judge Higgins asked, scanning the pages of the document. "I am, Your Honor," I replied. "I am the sole trustee with absolute exclusive control over the disbursement of all funds and properties. They are suing for an empty box." The checkmate was absolutely absolute. They had literally destroyed their entire lives for nothing. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and incredibly satisfying. Judge Higgins closed the trust document and set it down on her desk. She folded her hands and looked down at the petitioner's table with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "In my 20 years on the bench," Judge Higgins began, her voice rumbling like thunder, "I have seen families tear each other apart over money. I have seen greed make people do terrible things. But the level of depravity, arrogance, and sheer criminal entitlement I have witnessed in this courtroom today is beyond anything I have ever encountered." She picked up her gavel, her knuckles white with tension. "This petition is dismissed with prejudice, but this proceeding is far from over." Judge Higgins turned her gaze to Preston, who was practically hyperventilating in his chair. "Mr. Preston, you sat in my courtroom, placed your hand on a Bible, and deliberately lied to my face. You submitted a forged document to the court in a brazen attempt to steal millions of dollars. Bailiff, take him into custody immediately. He is a severe flight risk, and I am holding him without bail pending formal charges for felony perjury and forgery." 2 armed court officers immediately stepped forward, grabbing Preston by the arms and hauling him roughly to his feet. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoing in the courtroom was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. Preston did not struggle. He just stared blankly ahead, his entire fake Silicon Valley persona completely shattered. Chloe leaped out of her seat in the gallery, screaming at the top of her lungs. "You cannot do this!" she shrieked, tears streaming down her face, ruining her heavy makeup. "Let him go. He is a CEO. You cannot arrest him. Bailiff, remove her from my courtroom." Judge Higgins snapped her voice, cutting through Chloe's hysterics like a knife. Another officer grabbed Chloe's arm and escorted her, kicking and sobbing, out into the hallway. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut behind her, cutting off her screams. Judge Higgins then turned her attention to Calvin and Denise. "As for the two of you," the judge said, her voice cold and unforgiving, "I am immediately forwarding this entire trial transcript, along with the unredacted video evidence, to the state's attorney's office. I am formally recommending they open a criminal investigation into conspiracy to commit murder and severe elder abuse. Furthermore, I am sending the forensic financial files directly to the Internal Revenue Service and the Securities and Exchange Commission." Denise completely collapsed, sliding out of her chair and onto the hard wooden floor of the courtroom, wailing loudly. Calvin just sat there, paralyzed, staring at the mahogany table, realizing that the Fulton County Sheriff was likely already tossing his furniture onto the street in Atlanta at this exact moment. "Court is adjourned," Judge Higgins declared, bringing the gavel down with a deafening crack that sealed their fates forever. I stepped down from the witness box, carrying my briefcase. I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. My extended family, the aunts and uncles who had judged me and believed the lies on social media, parted like the Red Sea. None of them could look me in the eye. They hung their heads in shame, realizing they had sided with monsters. I did not stop to accept their silent apologies. I did not need them. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and walked out of the courthouse into the bright, freezing Chicago afternoon. The cold air filled my lungs, and for the first time in 35 years, I felt completely and entirely free. The heavy shadow of my biological family, the feeling of being the unwanted, abandoned child, was gone. I had protected Pop's legacy. The generational wealth he had spent his entire life building was completely safe, secured behind ironclad federal laws and an unbreakable trust. I did not keep the $4 million just for myself. I am a forensic accountant who lives a quiet, comfortable life. I did exactly what Pops would have wanted. I used the commercial properties to secure low-interest loans for Black-owned small businesses in South Chicago. I set up a massive educational foundation in his name, fully funding the college tuition for dozens of kids in our neighborhood who had the brains but lacked the financial support. I made sure his name would be spoken with deep respect in our community for generations to come. As for Calvin, Denise, and Preston, they got exactly what they deserved. Preston was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for fraud and perjury. Calvin and Denise lost their rented mansion, their luxury cars, and their fake online reputation. They were indicted on multiple federal tax evasion charges and are currently awaiting trial from a county jail cell. Chloe filed for bankruptcy and moved into a tiny studio apartment, finally forced to get a minimum wage job to survive. They wanted to destroy me. Instead, they handed me the hammer I used to shatter their entire world. Family is not defined by blood or biology. Blood simply makes you related. True family is defined by loyalty, by respect, and by the consistent choice to show up for each other. Pops was my true family. The community we helped build is my family. If you have ever been treated like an outsider by your own bloodline, if you have ever been underestimated, betrayed, or abandoned, do not let their cruelty define your worth. Your success, your peace, and your independence are the greatest forms of revenge you could ever achieve. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace and your future? How did you find the strength to walk away? I would love to read your stories in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice, resilience, and reclaiming your power. Remember that no matter where you start, you always have the power to write your own final chapter. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next video.